November 1963, a tank farm on the Bayonne waterfront, New Jersey. Inspectors from American Express climb the steel ladders to verify a claim on paper, $175 million of vegetable oil. One man lowers a weighted tape measure down into the dark. He waits. He hauls it back up. The tape is coated in oil. He writes down a full tank. But the tank underneath that thin film of oil was almost entirely seawater. The oil that secured a fortune in loans did not exist, and it had not existed for years. The man who filled those tanks with seawater was named Tino De Angelis. Everyone called him Tino, born in the Bronx in 1915, the son of Italian immigrants. As a teenager, he ran a meat market with 200 workers under him, and a trader's instinct for what a thing was worth before anyone else knew. By the end, he had convinced American Express, Bank of America, and dozens of banks to lend against oil that was mostly water. He nearly took the New York Stock Exchange down with him. And the day it broke open was the day a president was shot in Dallas. This is how.
Here is what the record shows about Tino De Angelis, long before anyone lowered a tape into his tanks. In the early 50s, he took over a meat company, the Adolf Goebel firm. He won a national school lunch contract, overcharged the government by $31,000, and shipped over 2 million pounds of uninspected meat. Goebel went bankrupt. 31,000 in 1952, about 376,000 in today's money. The crime left a paper trail, and no institution that later handed him hundreds of millions ever went looking for it.
1955. De Angelis puts $500,000 into a new company in Bayonne, about $6 million in today's money, and calls it Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation. His timing was deliberate. The US government was subsidizing food exports under a program called Food for Peace. Vegetable oil moving overseas meant federal money flowing back. Within a few years, Allied claimed more than 70% of all American soybean and cottonseed oil exports. To the banks, that reputation was armor. A man that big does not need to lie. That was the assumption. And the assumption was the whole problem. To turn oil into cash, De Angelis needed a middleman he could not forge alone. In 1957, he hired the American Express Field Warehousing Corporation. The arrangement was simple on paper. American Express men would guard the tanks, measure the oil, and issue warehouse receipts, certificates stating exactly how much oil sat inside. Those receipts were as good as cash. A trader could carry one to a bank and borrow against it, because a bank trusted the name stamped on top. De Angelis paid American Express Warehousing up to $20,000 a week for the service, according to the account by reporter Norman C. Miller. Around $210,000 a week today. The receipt was the key, and the key could be typed.
The most expensive fraud of its decade came down at the operational level to a woman at a typewriter. Her name was Josephine Salto, an Allied secretary. At trial, she testified that she was handed blank American Express warehouse receipts and told to type in whatever inventory figures she was given. Nobody verified the figures. Nobody asked for a supporting document. Picture financial crime, and you picture smoke-filled rooms. The actual mechanism was banal. A stack of blank forms, and a certification process that certified nothing.
By 1960, Allied needed to look bigger than it was, so De Angelis contracted a second company, Harbor Tank Storage, to run 24 additional tanks on the property, tanks Allied did not own. Then his men laid the trick that made the whole thing work. A hidden network of underground pipes connecting tank to tank. On weekends, when the yard was barely guarded, they pumped the same oil from one tank into the next, so whichever tank an inspector chose that day appeared full. Above them stood the last piece of theater. When an inspector lowered his tape, one of Allied's men would stand on the tank top and shout down a fabricated fill number. The inspector, on the ground, wrote it down.
A scheme like that only holds if nobody talks. De Angelis understood that better than any auditor. He built an inner core of 22 hand-picked men to run the pumps and manage the inspections, and he paid for their silence with something visible. Every one of them drove a Cadillac. Each got $400 a week in cash on top of his salary, plus frequent gifts, envelopes, extras. Think about what that buys. Not just loyalty. It buys 22 people who all now have a reason to keep the tanks looking full. The fraud didn't need enforcers, it needed shareholders in the lie.
By 1962, De Angelis stopped being a mere exporter and became a speculator. He set out to corner the market itself. The engine was a loop. Fake warehouse receipts became loans. Loans bought vegetable oil futures. Rising futures prices justified still more receipts and still more loans, which bought still more futures. The whole structure had one requirement, buried at its center. Prices had to keep rising. As long as oil went up, the margin calls stayed small and the loop kept spinning. By the summer of 1963, Allied controlled about 90% of all cottonseed oil contracts on the New York Produce Exchange. That summer, one board member of the Produce Exchange did notice. He looked at the unprecedented buying and recommended an investigation. The board took no action. The reason sat in the ledger. De Angelis was paying the exchange more than $100,000 every month in trading commissions alone. Over $1 million a month in today's terms. The man generating that revenue was the man the board would have had to investigate. The oversight and the income shared the same address. Before the tape goes back into the tank, if these are the stories you want more of, take a second and subscribe. Because what American Express did next turned a private fraud into a national crisis. By September 1963, the numbers inside American Express stopped making sense to the people who ran it. In that single month, the warehousing subsidiary issued $20 million in new receipts. The cumulative total reached $87.4 million. And here is the figure that should have frozen the building. American Express, the whole company, every asset, every traveler's check operation, had a total shareholder equity of $78.8 million. The subsidiary had guaranteed more oil than its own parent company was worth. $87 million against a net worth of $79, and the collateral behind it was Seawater under a film of oil. Part of the reason no one had pulled the cord earlier sat in the org chart. The warehousing division was the only unprofitable arm of American Express. The director, Donald Miller, was under explicit pressure to make it earn its keep. And De Angelis was his single most lucrative client, paying that $20,000 a week. The man responsible for scrutinizing the account was the man rewarded for keeping it. So it grew, $20 million in 1 month. Until senior officials, finally alarmed, made a quiet decision that autumn to sell the warehousing subsidiary before it swallowed them. They were already too late.
Look at what the American Express structure actually rewarded. A division under pressure to hit a profit number, a client willing to pay any fee to be left unexamined, and a certification whose entire value depended on nobody checking the thing it certified. Every incentive pointed the same direction, toward more receipts, larger loans, less scrutiny. The system performed exactly as it was built to perform. That is the uncomfortable lesson.
By mid-1963, De Angelis had built the largest speculative position of his life. Allied had contracted to buy the equivalent of 1.2 billion pounds of oil, a position worth $120 million, about 1.3 billion today. On November 14th, Allied held 90% of all outstanding cottonseed oil futures on the Produce Exchange. Roughly 80% of it was brokered through one respected Wall Street firm, Ira Haupt and Company. Haupt had borrowed $30 million from banks in the United States and Britain, pledging Allied's warehouse receipts as collateral. $316 million in today's money, secured by oil that was water. Everything now balanced on one condition. Prices had to hold. November 15th. In Washington, the US Senate broke off debate on a proposed grain deal with the Soviet Union. That deal had been the great hope for vegetable oil demand. With it stalled, the reason to expect rising prices vanished overnight. Soybean oil began to fall. And the loop that required rising prices ran the other way. That same day, the produce exchange demanded that Ira Haupt post an additional $14.1 million in margin to cover Allied's contracts. About $148 million today. Haupt called De Angelis for the money. He did not have it. He had never had it. The unraveling came fast. November 18th to 19th, Allied crude vegetable oil files for bankruptcy. Soybean oil crashes from $9.87.5 to $7.75 per hundredweight in 48 hours. The collateral behind every Allied loan collapses with it. Then the tanks are opened. Allied had claimed 1.8 billion pounds of oil. The real inventory was around 110 million pounds, a 16-to-1 fabrication. The rest was seawater and empty steel. November 20th. The New York Stock Exchange suspends Ira Haupt and Company from trading. It was the first time in the exchange's history that a major member firm was suspended because of a customer's failure. J.R. Williston and Bean were suspended the same day. Haupt was not a small operation. 16 partners, 700 employees, branches across the country, and 20,700 customers whose accounts were now frozen. The capital deficiency ran past $18 million, roughly $189 million today. Ordinary investors with no connection to salad oil could not reach their own money. November 22nd. NYSE President G. Keith Funston spent the morning trying to prevent panic selling by Haupt's 20,000 customers. That afternoon, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The two shocks hit the floor together. 2.6 million shares sold. The Dow fell 24 points, about 5%, in 27 minutes. The exchange closed 83 minutes early, and that forced closure did something no plan could have.
The market shut down after Dallas was born of grief, but it also, by accident, bought the one thing the rescuers needed: time. With the floor closed over that weekend, Funston and the banks could negotiate a way to unwind Ira Haupt without a chaotic Monday sell-off staring them down. On November 25th, the NYSE advanced $9.5 million, about $100 million today, to liquidate Haupt in an orderly way and protect those 20,000 customer accounts. The precedent mattered. An exchange had just accepted some responsibility for the customers of a failed member firm. That principle is a direct ancestor of the investor protection system Americans rely on now.
Then came the accounting of the wreckage. December 30th, 1963. American Express field warehousing files for bankruptcy, listing $130,000 in assets against $210 million in claims, according to the account by Norman C. Miller. Banks were left holding $37 million in loans they could not recover. American Express stock fell from $65 to $37, a 43% drop. In 1964, American Express settled the warehousing claims for $60 million, about $623 million today, and left the field warehousing business entirely. As for De Angelis, charged with 19 counts of fraud and conspiracy, he pleaded guilty to 4 and was sentenced to 20 years. He served about 7 at Lewisburg and was released in 1972. While American Express bled, a 33-year-old investor in Omaha was doing arithmetic no one else bothered with. His name was Warren Buffett. He reasoned that the fraud had wrecked the balance sheet, but the thing that made American Express valuable, the traveler's checks and the charge cards, was untouched. So he checked. He reportedly sat in restaurants and hotels and watched, counting how many customers still paid with an American Express card. They still did. Then he committed about $13 million, nearly 40% of his partnership's assets, to the stock everyone else was fleeing. Around $135 million in today's money. The stock tripled.
The Standard account calls this the story of one gifted con man who fooled the giants. The record says something harder. Every institution that lost money had the means to lower a tape of its own. The Produce Exchange had a board member who asked the question. American Express had a balance sheet screaming that it had guaranteed more than it was worth. The government already had a fraud file on De Angelis sitting unread in another agency. None of them looked because looking was expensive and trusting was free. Till the day it wasn't. De Angelis came out in 1972 and almost immediately reached for another scheme, a cattle venture that collapsed before it started. The individual was never really the problem to solve. So here is the question worth carrying out of Bayonne. The certification that failed there, the stamp that meant nothing because nobody checked behind it, how many of those stamps do we still trust today? On collateral, we have never once measured ourselves.